I had a contact experience with non-human ET craft and individuals. And there was an ET craft that appeared before sunset in the southwest, close, and it materialized, came into 3D and vanished. I thought it was a deer standing on its hind legs because it had beautiful almond-shaped eyes, and came over and today, we really want to focus heavily on the contrasts. And I would call this podcast military and corporate psionic contact with NHI versus CE5 contact. What's the difference? What are the distinctions? Why are those distinctions important? And why we want to do CE5 contact and not a militaristic contact. So I think people need clarity on that because a lot of information has recently come out about the government programs about that. And by the way, you should get the CE5 contact app. You can get it for your smartphones. It's a whole training program in consciousness, remote viewing, contact, all the protocols, how to form a team, the equipment you need, et cetera, and so on. So just remember that. Also, if you want one of these shirts, you can get them at our store. drstevengreer.com has a link to it. So a lot of people who are on CE5 teams like to have those, and it's just sort of fun. I'm wearing it today because I like blue. It's my favorite color. Yeah, it's totally my favorite color. It's what the Earth looks like from space, like this. So the Earth is so beautiful. And so first, let me lay the foundation of where my comments are coming from. And this is going to disturb a lot of people. So I'll give you a trigger warning right here. In 1991, I wrote a paper, which you can see in our first book, and we can actually, put the cover of this up on the screen. Extraterrestrial Contact, the Evidence and Implications. It came out in the 90s. And it's a collection of white papers and position papers on this subject. One of the early ones I wrote was the comprehensive assessment of the UFO/ETI subject, ETI being extraterrestrial intelligence, now called NHI, non-human intelligence. And in it, I go through a series of analyses. As soon as that hit the early internet, and it did, it got picked up by the aerospace industry and the agency, the CIA and others. And I heard from them directly. One of the people, who's a wonderful, wonderful man, Dr. Robert Woods, became one of our whistleblower witnesses in the early disclosure project. And he was worked with McDonnell Douglas, and in fact, had been tasked with Mr. McDonald, founder of McDonnell Douglas, to look into the ET technologies and including their psi capabilities and the technology and psi capabilities back in the 1960s. So when he read this comprehensive assessment, he found a section where I talk about consciousness interfacing with technology, and technology that can augment consciousness, where it goes both ways. And I called it TAC, technology assisted consciousness, and consciousness assisted technology, CAT. So there's TAC and CAT. I'll just use that from now on because it's short. It's a nice acronym. So TAC and CAT it's a two-way system where an individual's consciousness and mind and what we call coherent thought can interface seamlessly with very advanced electromagnetic systems that are phasing transdimensionally. In other words, beyond just the speed of light, and vice versa. And I had discovered this is perhaps more disturbing to most people, in 1973, and I was 18. So now I've known about this for 51 years. Because I was 18 then, I'm 69 now. And I had a contact experience with non-human ET craft and individuals, because 6 months earlier I had had an extraordinary near-death experience, and then began to study, after I survived that physical catastrophe, what consciousness was and what the deep spirit of ourselves is. And I became a very avid student of consciousness, quantum entanglement, where everything's connected to each other through the mind, and began to do this. And then one night, one fateful night in October 1973, I'm up in the mountains of North Carolina, and I go up to meditate in this remote place up at about 5,200 feet up. And crystal clear day, gorgeous. And there was an ET craft that appeared before sunset in the southwest, close, and it materialized, came into 3D, and vanished. It was exactly the craft my twin sister and some boys in the neighborhood, when I was growing up in North Carolina near Charlotte, saw in 1963 when I was 8 years old. And so I just acknowledged them and didn't think more about it. And I said, well, that's interesting, they're back. And so I go into this very deep meditation. And at the end of it, I come out of this deep state, and I have an experience that was exactly like what I experienced when I died 6 months earlier in March of 1973, where I was, but at this point, instead of being out of my body in space, I was in my body on the ground, but where that state of unity consciousness, the oneness of consciousness that's infinite within all of us, I experienced while my eyes were open. And I thought, well, this is amazing. And this beautiful thought was sent to me. It said, behold, what a beautiful universe God has made. And the whole Milky Way was stretched over. I sort of became one with that. And the whole cosmos while I was in my body. Now remember, this is 1973. I didn't have the knowledge I have now of either ETs, NHI, or even a deep study in consciousness or physics. You know, I had just come out of high school, right? And I was my first semester of college. So this was up in the mountains of North Carolina, by the way. But with that, I then realized that over the crest of the hill was a glow. And it was this craft I'd seen before I went into meditation. And all of a sudden, it didn't walk up, it just appeared, was a person who, in my young man's mind, I thought it was a deer standing on its hind legs, because it had beautiful almond-shaped eyes, and came over and touched. Now, I was wearing a kind of a ski jacket because it was cold. You know, you're up that high in October, and it was really a beautiful crystal clear front. It come in from Canada, you know, where it's chilly at night. And so it probably was in the maybe 30s, 40s. So I had this coat on. I could see the ET. It then became invisible and touched my shoulder, but I could see it indent the puffiness, and I could feel it touch. I could replicate it on you. If I were to touch you, I could tell you exactly the force of how it touched me, very firmly but gently. And with that, I dematerialized and went on a craft. Now, I thought that was about half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. It turned out it was 3 or 4 hours. And that is when I studied and meditated with this group of NHI people to create what we now call the CE5 contact initiative and protocols. And that's what we're doing. And that's how it started. So that's the genesis of actual CE5 contact. Very different from what I'm about to talk about. Now, the reason I'm giving you this short summary, which you can read about this other places more thoroughly, I think in my book, Hidden Truths, Forbidden Knowledge, it goes into this in some more detail. But I'm not going to waste a lot of time on that. It's a beautiful story, actually. Now people say, oh, you were abducted. I said, no, I was contacted, and there's a big difference. So I had contact, not abduction. So it was a very amazing, beautiful, and like our special forces friend commented, it's overwhelmingly beautiful, and it's overwhelmingly loving and high consciousness, and it's just hard to put into words. That's why it's so emotional. That's real contact. The scary stuff is CIA. So if you haven't figured that out yet, I'm sorry, but you're 30 years behind the curve of what we've been disclosing. Now, so, hurry up, catch up, slow-mo. I mean, this is the train's left the station. Now, here's the other part. So here's the other part of this. So time goes by the time I start this project in 1990, which is in itself another whole podcast, but we'll get into that. I want to address this because we'll run out of time. Okay, I'm going to skip over a whole lot of information that's really quite beautiful and amazing. I immediately decided that it was going to primarily be focused on contact peacefully with NHI ETs for the purpose of creating a interplanetary relationship and to create a civilization that will evolve from where it is now, isolated, fighting amongst itself, to peaceful and going out into space peacefully. And that was the sort of task I was given to do. So that's the genesis of CE5 contact. Very, very simple in a way. It's extraordinary to some people, but to me it's very clear and clean and direct and pure. So when I started the project, I started going to, I didn't know anyone anyone related to this subject. So I went to a couple meetings. I went to some UFO organizations annual conference in 1990 in the summer. Got intercepted by some CIA guys who somehow knew who I was, which I was obscure. I'm a doctor, trauma, emergency, and I said, well, how do you know me? But somehow I was on the radar. And then the following year, went to another one where the board of that organization pulled me in. They said, we're all either intelligence or former intelligence officials. I'm not going to say what the organization is, but you would all know it if I spoke it. So I said, well, that's fine. And they wanted me to be on the board. I said, no, I'm not interested. I don't want to be involved in that sort of thing. Right. And around that same time, a man approached me who was this old curmudgeon, brilliant, genius scientist in his 80s. But in 1956, now think about this, 1956, I was 1 year old. He had invented a very advanced electromagnetic system, like a headset that you could wear. And it would facilitate through very advanced electronics going into a state of consciousness where you could remote view, but also remotely influence places through consciousness and thought. And it was real.
So this was TAC?
Yes.
Man-made TAC?
Yes. This was man-made technology-assisted consciousness, but also it was consciousness that could assist or influence other technology or 3D objects. So it was both. And he offered it to me because he was going to die soon. He was probably in his mid-80s. So remember, this is 1991. He had admitted it in 1956 under spooky arrangements with the military-industrial complex. But remember, we started studying ET material and craft at least by the 40s, mid-40s. So that's 11 years on. And one of the projects was communications. Not everyone gets stuck on energy and propulsion, but there's a lot more, right? Now, when you start talking about trans-dimensional communications, interstellar, where you have to communicate across the vastness of space, you're going through the ultimate trans-dimensional switchboard known as mind consciousness in its non-local, expanded, infinite form. And this is why I tell people the operating system for CE5 contact or for anything dealing with these civilizations is understanding very deeply the science of consciousness, period. Now, of course, I've always been ridiculed for this, called a kook, called a quack, I don't care. I'm sort of bulletproof for what you want to call me. But because I've been called everything over the last 35 years, but that is a fact. Now that's coming out now with what they're talking about with these P3 and psionic programs. But I want to explain the stark difference, very stark. There are 180 degrees diametrically opposed. Now, eventually I told this gentleman, I said, look, if I possess something like that, I'm quite sure I'll be killed. And I don't think that most people are at a level of higher consciousness where they can possess such a technology and not use it for selfish purposes. Because something like that is so powerful. Forget AI. This would be that on mega steroids, right? That is something that there has to be a certain evolution in human consciousness and peaceful consciousness. And I hate to use these old-fashioned terms, altruism and selflessness, before you possess that. Now, I would have been able to possess it and done no harm. But I don't think that that's something that, if you look at the fact that about 12% of humans are sociopaths, and within that category, there are a lot that are psychopaths, who usually become dictators and leaders around the world and CEOs of companies. That is not a great idea, okay? So I said, thank you, but no thank you. And I'm glad to know that this exists because it explains a lot of what I already had begun to experience by people approaching me from the intelligence community. And then a year later, approximately, I can't remember the month, in 91 that I met this gentleman. He's long since passed away. And by the way, the company, there was a front company that was a cutout fronting for the CIA that bought that technology called Alpha Metric Corporation, is what he told me. I'm sure there's no trace of it. I'm sure it was something, an invisible shell company that absorbed it and then took it. But he still understood the science.
Alpha is an alphabet?
Yeah, Alpha Metric Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So do with that what you will. So, I mean, that's 1956. I mean, they can erase records. If there's any track record of it, I'd be surprised. Nevertheless, I said, thanks, but no thanks, right? For the reasons I just explained. It's security and safety. I didn't think it was something that we were ready to do. And I knew it would put a big bullseye on us and on me. So, but he was a sincere guy wanting to help because he thought this is what we should have always used this for, right? Is what you're doing, not what the military industrial complex, not what Lockheed and Northrop and Raytheon and the military people who are running covert programs using tech like this to target and down ET crap and kill them, right?
So they're using technology like this remote viewing assist to augment and amplify the psionics?
Correct. Yeah, the really high-end parts of it. So remember, all these projects are compartmentalized. If you are in one project, you might have been using one system. If you're in another, there may be another, a deeper one. You have to understand the extreme compartmentalization. So a special operator in one will absolutely not be read into something going on. It could be 10 miles away on another. They're just not. There's not this sort of all-access pass on projects this compartmented. Now, this is why I describe what we're doing with this podcast, the disclosure mosaic. I want to put together 35 years, or more than that, since I was 18, years of this sort of experience and evidence and meeting these sort of officials and scientists and give you this big mosaic. Because it's time to pull all this together, frankly. Because it's all going to come out. There has to be context and the understanding, not only the history of it, but also in that history are some warnings of what not to do going forward.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the next one right here on the Best of Dr. Stephen Greer.